be relaxed and to listen to the talk, knowing that there'll be a sign-up sheet when you get out if you need one. So I also have one other thing for you, and that is a survey from the Independent Institute. I'm sorry, this is from the Institute for Humane Studies. They're a funder of our Provocative lecture series. And at one time, we were really seriously considering trying to get an increase in your student fees or your tuitions to help pay for these things. But we realized that that would be too difficult. So instead, we worked really hard to go out and raise money to bring speakers to give you some provoking thoughts. And what the donors asked for in return is a little bit of feedback. So it's an incredibly short little survey. And if you would fill this out and leave it at the table outside, we would really appreciate it. It would make our job providing you outstanding speakers easier. And then we don't have to go and raise fees and stuff like that. So I'm going to distribute these to you guys in the room right now. All you have to do is fill it out before you leave and leave it on the table by the books outside. So that's about it. Also, I'll give you a couple of extras so when somebody comes in, you can hand it to them and pass along the instructions of fill it out and turn it in. So now I'll turn this back to Jack.
Oh, I think it's time. Okay, so I'd like to welcome you all to our second provocative lecture for this fall semester of 2015, and I want to thank you all for coming. I think you'll enjoy yourself, so welcome. This is a good time to take out that alter ego that you have, maybe, and put it on stun of some kind. Mine went off today during the presentation. I thought that was pleasant. Let's just look here and see what we have. Oh yeah, that's good. Okay. I'd appreciate it if you would all do that as well. I'd also like to announce that we will have a meeting of what we call the Barstool Economists. Many of you know about the Barstool Economists, and we will meet at Flames Restaurant immediately after the lecture tonight, or as quickly as we can all walk over there. And I believe that there may be some pizza and beer waiting for everyone if you care to join us. And I know that most of the students here just love hanging out with their professors. It does take free beer sometimes to get you to go, but anyway, we look forward to having you come and join us. So the Barstool Economists is a group that is now has sort of a national presence, and it's a bunch of I should say, at least from my own perspective, econ nerds, who like to hang out on the internet and discuss economic topics. And so if you're interested in joining, you all only need to send in a request or come and see one of us, and we'll see if we can't get you on the list. Additionally, if everyone knows where Flames is, it is on the other side of San Fernando at 4th and San Fernando, and underneath the garage there. And we will probably be hanging out there for at least a couple hours. So please feel free to come and join us. Our next provocative lecture, just to give you a little preview, will be on November 5th, which is a Thursday, and Mike Munger from Duke University will come and be speaking about price gouging, one of my favorite topics because it always generates a lot of interest. So if you're a big fan of price gouging, how many people are a big fan of price gouging here besides me? Absolutely, okay. You will enjoy this talk. It's a very well prepared talk. So that'll be at the same time and same place on November the 5th, a Thursday. This lecture series started 14 years ago to foster our vision of higher education, the challenge of ideas, and the development of critical thinking in an environment of respectful intellectual discourse. Please relax and listen to Professor Haeffele-Balch tonight as she discusses her observations about disaster recovery and community entrepreneurship. She will provide a question and answer period at the end of her presentation to allow the audience to explore specifics with her, and we hope that this lecture will encourage a greater understanding about how communities deal with disaster, as well as an appreciation for just the general pursuit of knowledge. Before I do that and go any further, you were going to start to put your arms up and wave to me, weren't you? We have a guest, Ann Bridges, is with us tonight to listen to the lecture, but she also has a book that she's just written on entrepreneurship, and I'd like her to come up and say a few words about her book. Please, Ann. Let's give her a hand.
Good evening, and thank you for inviting me here for just a few minutes. Great topic, local entrepreneurship. Silicon Valley is the model for most of the world about how to start up new companies. And I come from that environment. I had a career in Silicon Valley corporate technology, communications, and entertainment. And I decided to retire out and actually take a novel approach to sharing some of the inside information I learned through going through an IPO, running my own consulting company, working with firms from Asia to Europe, big and tiny. And I wrote a fictional account of a software engineer who's trying to go public and dealing with all sorts of different conflicts and obstacles to overcome. And the book is called Private Offerings, and the San Jose State Campus Reading Program invited me to talk next Wednesday, October 28th at 4 o'clock till 5:30 at MLK, the library, room 225. And we're going to be comparing my more realistic view of what it was like to be in Silicon Valley and run a startup company and the issues associated with it, with The Circle, Dave Eggers' book, which is the Campus Reading Program book for 2015. For those of you who haven't read it, it's more of a science fiction approach, kind of a dystopian view of the Facebook, Google networking environment. In my mind, a little far-fetched, and so Mike Fallon is going to be discussing how many of these issues are realistic, how many of them are a little bit pie in the sky, and what is it really like to be an entrepreneur here in Silicon Valley. So all you econ students, when you finally graduate and you realize you have to do something with that degree that's a little bit more practical, and you're probably going to be in the business world, it's a very good way for you to read something besides a 350-page tome of dry econ textbooks. No slight intended to any professors who've written one. Mine is a fast-paced action suspense thriller that's a lot easier to get through. So I invite you all to join me as again next Wednesday, October 28th at 4 o'clock. Put it in your calendars, and I hope to see you there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ann. Thank you. I encourage you all to go. We are also fortunate tonight to have Stefanie Haeffele-Balch with us. Stefanie is from Mercatus Center, a part of George Mason University. Her studies center on the theme of innovation and entrepreneurship. Along with co-authors Virgil Henry Storr and Laura E. Grube, Stefanie spent 5 years studying disaster recovery. Their forthcoming book, which we had hoped would actually be out by now, but I think is right on the edge of being published, Community Revival in the Wake of Disaster argues that creating space for entrepreneurs to act after disasters is essential for promoting recovery and fostering resilient communities. So in addition to that, Stefanie just defended her thesis and was awarded her doctorate on October the 1st. And so I think we all should give her a big hand for that. It's now Professor Stefanie. And for all of those of you who are thinking about going on and getting a PhD, you can see when she stands up the look of relief that she has on her face. Stefanie is the Deputy Director of Academic and Student Programs at the Mercatus Center at George Mason, and she is an alumni of Mercatus Center's MA Fellowship Program. After receiving an MA in Economics from George Mason University in 2010, she completed the Presidential Management Fellowship, where she worked in emergency and disaster operations at both FEMA and the U.S. Forest Service. She earned a BBA in Economics and in Finance from the University of North Alabama in 2007. Please welcome Professor Stefanie Haeffele-Balch.
Hi, Hi, like you mentioned, I'm Stefanie Haeffele-Balch. Don't get too scared away by the way my last name is spelled. I'll respond to almost any of it, so it's a little complicated. But first, I would like to say thank you to Jack and Dr. Ortega and the whole economics department at San Jose State University for inviting me here. This project has really been one of the major things that I've done as I started graduate school and finished my dissertation. So it's really exciting to talk to you about it here today. Just to add a little bit to what Jack mentioned in his introduction, I first started with a master's degree at George Mason and did a fellowship there, and then really started getting to work with the professors on their projects that they were doing, including disaster recovery. Decided to go out for a couple of years and see what it was like in the areas that I was studying, and then readily came back to work on our fellowship programs and do the PhD as well. So it's really been looking at disaster recovery that really drove a lot of why I went back to school and do those things as well. So let's get started. All right, so the first question is, why study disasters over all the other options that you have to study? And I think John Stuart Mill was one of the first to really kind of look around and see how incredible it was that different communities and whole countries were able to really rebound after disasters, whether they were war, famine, other natural disasters. And the question is why? And so John Stuart Mill really takes a lot of that with the market, and he looks at how our progress as a society has really made us more resilient and robust. So along that line, after Hurricane Katrina hit on August 29th in 2005, the Mercatus Center went about studying what would happen there. It was a major storm with major aftermath that would happen in the next couple of weeks with the levees breaking and major government failure. And so the question was, how could we design a program to go down there and really study what all is going on with disaster recovery? So with the lead of Dr. Peter Becky, a whole group of scholars started on a 5-year project to study community recovery after Hurricane Katrina. And they were really looking at 3 major areas. First was the public sector. How did they respond after the disaster? What failures did they encounter? What were their successes? The second was the private sector. What was the role of big business? What about small businesses, and how were they able to recover? Did they face issues with government or in other areas? And then the third is really civil society at large, or the cultural aspect. So how did neighbors and community members decide to recover? And so it was through investigating all those 3 areas that we really began to look at what is important about community recovery and what can we bring to the table. And it's really that look that, with the economics department here, you are focusing a lot on Austrian and public choice economics. We do that at George Mason as well. And so it's really through those lenses and also institutional analysis that we were able to kind of get a new insight into how these people recovered. With Austrian economics, not only that the market is a process, but that government and all interaction is a process, but also that we're fallible human beings that need to kind of discover and err and learn as we go about figuring out how to run a business, but also how to recover after a disaster. And then those public choice insights were really important as well. Sort of what were the institutional paradigms that were in place that made FEMA fail, or made these other areas fail when we tried to have them work? And what does that mean for what they can do afterwards? So after Katrina, a lot of effort was put to make FEMA better and more capable. What insights could we bring to whether or not that would be possible or not? So when you look at a major disaster like Hurricane Katrina, one thing's very clear. It's a daunting challenge. There's one, they just need to obtain a lot of resources to either stay being displaced in a region until you could come back to your home, resources to repair and rebuild your home, but also maybe find a new job and find new ways to go about living your life. In addition to that, there's a major emotional toll for people who are encountering these. Not only are there potential deaths and injuries that can take place, but also just the idea that a lot of your cherished memories and physical artifacts are gone. And because of that, you really have to think about what are the opportunity costs to recovering. In particularly after Hurricane Katrina, when there was a lot of people displaced for months at a time. How easy is it to just pick up and start fresh somewhere else? And is that the best option that you have? And so one way we talk about this in economics is to call it a collective action problem, right? So the rebuilding costs, returning, are considerable. Sometimes way far out of reach, potentially things that you have to pay for now but might not get reimbursed from insurance or FEMA or other areas until much later down the process. And the benefits to rebuilding can be a little unclear. You might want to come back to your neighborhood, but what if no one else does? The cultural aspect that you had, your neighbors, they might be gone. It might not be worth it to invest all this time to come and rebuild if your community doesn't look the same that it did before. And the worse the disaster, the worse all these uncertainties are. So it's true after a tornado that hits just a small patch of land, whether or not that's going to affect what you're doing, but even worse after Katrina, where you have sort of major displacement, major property damage. And so in that scenario, it's pretty rational to expect people to wait and wait for others to see if they'll come back first. But in that case, then nobody returns. And we don't see that. So why do people, what is the impetus that brings people to be the first mover? And so that's what we're looking at in our study. So the real question that we came about asking was, how do people overcome the collective problem after post-disaster recovery? And what are those people? Is it government that helps do that? Is it local community leaders? Is it just sort of random to see how that goes about? And what we found is that it's the entrepreneur who is uniquely suited to drive disaster recovery. And we look at the entrepreneur in a pretty broad sense of the term. So often you might think of that person as just being in the commercial sector, just being those figures that we really think about, like Steve Jobs or different people like that. But we're thinking about it a little bit more broadly. It can include social entrepreneurs, ideological entrepreneurs, as well as political ones. So who are these people who are taking on risks, being adaptive and flexible, who are being the first movers in that scenario? And we think that that could be the leader of a church, as well as a nonprofit, or that lady at the end of your block who really makes sure everybody comes to all the events that you have, as well as the business owner who's been around for a long time and making new innovative calls as well. And the way we look at that is really to think about a connection of two major theories in entrepreneurship. So we look first at the work of Israel Kirzner, who's an Austrian economist, and he really looks at the role that entrepreneurs play in coordinating activities and seeking errors and finding new ways to solve those errors. And so in many ways, he's really thinking about entrepreneurship as arbitrage, as kind of fixing those gaps and coming after profit opportunities. But in another way, it's really about social learning. And so how do profit opportunities, since he focused mostly on the commercial sector, really drive people to find new ways to provide goods and services for their communities? And then the second theory that we bring together is from Joseph Schumpeter. And that's really the sort of challenging, innovative, destructive aspect of entrepreneurship, the fact that you will find new processes and replace those with old ones. And it's really the combination of those two as seeing opportunities and going after them that we use in the book that we provide. And so in that case, we really see the entrepreneur as the hero of our story. And that follows with what some other scholars in entrepreneurship have said as well, that just the fact that they're willing to take on those risks and be a first mover provides them with courage that you might not see otherwise and when you're looking at the market. And so specifically, we see that an entrepreneur, broadly defined in this way, can lower the costs, increase the benefits, and increase the probability that other people will return to after a disaster. And so how do we think that we can do that? Well, first, kind of thinking just on the commercial sector, an entrepreneur can lower those costs by providing new services or making it easier to access those services. So after a disaster, you might see shortages in gasoline and wood and other building materials. that increase in price or price gouging, like you'll hear next month, is really what's going to bring entrepreneurs to provide those services to the market. The more people that provide those services, either bringing gasoline or materials or going down to help repair homes, is going to lower the cost of finding people to do that and get that back up into space. By increasing benefits, they might provide entirely new experiences that you didn't have before, or make sure that other people are coming and returning as well. And so that might mean, opening up a store where people can go and hang out and talk about their problems, becoming a social space in that scenario. Not only could they maybe spend time filling out forms for federal assistance, but talk about the issues they've had, learn about what contractors are good and which ones aren't. And so by creating that coffee shop or that restaurant, you're really not just providing the food that people need in that time, but a social space where they can interact. And that's going to increase the benefits of coming back, because that that other people will be there too, and there's a place where you can go meet those people in that time. And then increasing the probability that where others will return is really kind of being that focal point for recovery. And so if you know that these businesses are coming back and they're investing in your community, that means that they think that the culture and the neighborhood that was before will return, or it will come back better than it was before. And so that might be enough just to see that other people are returning to decide that you want to return as well. And one thing to note here too is that the collective action problem isn't unique to just the residents and victims of a disaster that you normally think about. The government and all of the government actors who are trying to provide resources for response and recovery also face the same collective action problem. Should we really invest in fixing infrastructure to make sure our utilities are running again if we don't know that people are going to return to that area? Or should we really try to push for building codes or zones to be suspended if we don't think anybody's going to come back and return? So why should we make that effort, you might think about, to see who will go for that? So it's, again, those entrepreneurs, not just in the commercial sector, but the people in government too that might say, we need to make sure people can come back. And that might be in changing policies that make it easier for people to rebuild. In the book, we focus on 3 major functions that the entrepreneur plays. The first is to provide needed goods and services. The second is to repair disrupted social networks that need to be able to function in order for everyday life to come back to normal. And the third is to signal rebound or work as a focal point for recovery. That impetus that you can, just by being there and opening to business, signal that you're trying to get back to normal and that other people should too. And for the disasters we studied 2 major hurricanes. They're the 2 costliest hurricanes in US history. First, Hurricane Katrina and its effects of the greater New Orleans area in Louisiana. And like I mentioned before, Hurricane Katrina hit on August 29th in 2005. So we just came up on the 10-year anniversary of the storm. And it wasn't just the storm itself, but the breaking of the levees and the major flooding that happened afterwards that were the major causes for damage, but also for the death and other destruction that was there as well. And then the second hurricane is Hurricane Sandy. It mostly affected the upper East Coast of the United States, particularly New York, New Jersey, Maryland, but also Maine and other areas like that. It was October 29th in 2012, so it's almost 3 years since that storm hit. When preparing for this presentation, I realized maybe there's, maybe a causation or correlation thing with the 29th of a month, if that's where it should come. But these are 2 major storms. They were slightly anticipated. People could evacuate or prepare, but the level of damage that they caused was not anticipated. And both government and private sector response really had to adapt and deal with a lot of issues that came up afterwards. So particularly about the the damage and destruction that Hurricane Katrina caused. It was over 1,800 deaths, over $100 billion in damage, and it displaced over 400,000 people in the Gulf Coast area. So you could think of an entire city having to be dispersed throughout the United States in either to evacuate before the storm and to deal with the fact that they couldn't go home for weeks to months afterwards because of the flooding and other issues that were caused. I showed this photo before, but this is a photo of New Orleans right after the levees broke, so you can see just flooding, massive flooding. And then in early 2016, these photos, or 2006, these photos were taken. About 55% of the houses in Orleans Parish were either destroyed or severely damaged. So this was a very common view after the water retreated. And it's pretty clear from the aftermath of the storm that the government was not able to anticipate the needs or react to the changing issues that were taking place after the storm. So here is the Superdome, where they had numerous issues dealing with people who hadn't evacuated and what to do with them afterwards, but also just several issues with FEMA being able to provide even water or supplies down to the storm and other things like that. In a recent NPR story, President Obama even admitted to government failure that happened at that time. And so after working in FEMA afterwards, almost everyone recognized that Katrina was a disaster. The question was how to fix it later. So many people thought they needed more resources and more time to plan and more control from the top. Where you'll see from what we look at, it's really allowing for the residents and local entrepreneurs to really thrive after a disaster. And you'll notice too that the recovery took a long time. So 5 years after the hurricane, people still looked around to New Orleans and saw that they weren't fully recovered. And you'll see as of 2012, about 85% of the active households in the greater New Orleans area were back and active again. That data is mostly made on sort of mailboxes and mail that's used, but it shows quite a bit to show that a year after the storm, 50% of the population was gone, and even over 5 years afterwards, they were still recovering. If you go back to New Orleans now, it looks pretty much like it was before. So the question would be, even though there were months of uncertainty and numerous plans that came from the top down that changed, and I'll go into that a bit more later, people were able to recover. But it was slow and uneven, so what issues could we see from this storm that might help us see what to do for policies for next time? And the second storm is Hurricane Sandy. So again, it was October 29th of 2012. Over 150 casualties for this storm, so much less than Hurricane Katrina, but over $60 billion in property damage. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the damage occurred in heavily populated areas. So while it didn't have the magnitude of flooding that Katrina did, the concentration of people that had to deal with it was quite high. And so you'll see here, this was a pretty normal view of what you saw from the media immediately after the storm. So that's the Brooklyn Bridge and a ton of flooding underneath it. But where a lot of the people were most worst off were further out from the city itself. And so here, this is in New Jersey, a major roadway is just gone, and a lot of the houses in that area are uninhabitable at that time. And then here in a peninsula of New York, not only did they have to deal with flooding and power going out, but then when the power went out, a fire was started, and so there were huge neighborhoods engulfed in flames. So not only did they have to deal with the flooding, but also all of these other issues as well. And so for post-Sandy, it was really more about response than immediate recovery of what we looked into when we studied it. So many of these areas, like I mentioned with the New Jersey picture, is that they were kind of isolated peninsulas that have less population than the main city. But that also meant that when the power went out and kind of roads are flooded, that those isolated areas became even more isolated, and you had a hard time getting resources to those peninsulas along New York and New Jersey. To add to that, it was the end of October, and so the temperatures dropped very quickly the next 2 weeks, and power was out for at least 2 weeks during that amount of time. And then to look at the recovery afterwards, there were some buyout programs and things like that that were in place, as well as some renters assistance programs that came about since New York is composed of so many renters. But again, those programs faced trouble getting off the ground or issues further down the road. So rebuilding was slow and uneven in that aspect too. But in many ways, it was the really 2 weeks after the storm when people were stuck in their apartments or their homes during kind of lower temperatures without power. How did they respond? How did they work together to get through those 2 weeks after the storm? So in order to really dig into what people did immediately after these storms, we took on numerous interviews. So we went to the place where people were recovering and talked to individuals about how they experienced their community beforehand, what they did during the storm, and what their community has done afterwards. So for Hurricane Katrina, we had a massive team that was available to go down and do many interviews. There were over 300 interviews in the greater New Orleans area, focusing on numerous neighborhoods throughout that area. And then we went to Houston and talked to over 50 people to hear why they didn't return to Katrina afterwards. Why did they decide to stay in Houston afterwards and restart their lives there? And those interviews really took place over the 3 years between 2006 and 2009. For Hurricane Sandy, we wanted to sort of replicate the same study, but went for a much smaller scale. So we focused on the Rockaway Peninsula, which is the southernmost part of the Queens Borough in New York City, and focused on one neighborhood in particular, the Orthodox Jewish community there, which already had a bunch of club goods and organizations in place. And we wanted to see how did they respond after the storm to kind of get through those 2 weeks immediately after the hurricane hit. And so there we had about 16 interviews, and we spent multiple weeks during the summers of 2013 and 14 sort of in those communities, first trying to break into the Orthodox Jewish community. So Laura and I both went down there and had to show that we were interested in learning what they were doing, but also didn't have a lot of background in the particular culture and aspects of their community. And then they really just opened the doors to us and let us come in and see what organizations they had set up, what they did during the storm, and also taught us a lot about their culture in the meantime as well. So just to see on the map, this is New Orleans, and so it's kind of widespread throughout the greater New Orleans area. There's about 3 parishes, similar to counties, that we dug into, and the entrepreneurs that we talked to were kind of spread out throughout the place. But you'll notice, particularly around the river is where a lot of the levees and the kind of in-between Lake Pontchartrain and the river is where a lot of the levees broke. So particularly the lower 9th Ward and the areas within St. Bernard Parish had 10 to 12 feet of flooding after the storm. And then to see on the map here too, the Rockaway Peninsula is sort of southern, just underneath Long Island. And so it's kind of the southernmost part of the Queens Borough, right next to the JFK airport. So that's really where we're in. The sort of narrowest part of the peninsula is less than half a mile wide. So it's a really thin strip of land. And it wasn't actually the storm surge from the ocean that caused the most flooding and damage, but it went through into the bay and kind of the flooding came from the back end. So they kind of had water coming from both areas. So they dealt with a lot of flooding, but then also had to deal with the fact that they were fairly isolated from the rest of the city during that time as well. So after talking to all these people, we really found that there are leaders within the communities, whether businessmen, pastors, or rabbis, or local nonprofit organizational leaders, or that lady on the side of your street that makes sure everybody kind of comes together. And what did they do? They went above and beyond to provide needed goods and services, sometimes purely for a profit motive, but sometimes not, sometimes just to see that their community would return. They restored social networks, and they served as a focal point for recovery. So I've got 3 examples that dig into each one. The first one's from Hurricane Sandy. Rabbi Bender was a major everyone who we talked to mentioned getting resources or help from Rabbi Bender at some time or another. And often we'd be in somebody's living room talking to them about the storm, and they'd get a phone call about somebody being in the hospital or somebody being sick, and the immediate question was, have you called Rabbi Bender? So we knew we needed to find out about him. And he started a center called the Achiezer Community Resource Center. And he started that in 2009 after he had a health issue that he encountered himself. So he spent a couple of weeks in the hospital and realized how much of a toll that takes on his family and those people around him, and how difficult it was to make sure that people in the hospital knew all of the sort of rituals and rules that they live by as being Orthodox Jew, but also just the emotional toll of dealing with insurance companies and figuring out what to do next and how to kind of help the person in the hospital and your whole family while still having enough income to continue and different things like that. So he realized during that time that he could provide a service for his community through the Achiezer Community Center. So what do? They have a hotline, so you can call anytime you have an issue, and they'll either help get an ambulance or a hospital. They've trained EMTs and people in hospitals to know what rules and rituals the Orthodox Jewish population lives by and what they need to do. But they also just are counselors to help people during that time. They also help people fill out insurance forms and get new services that they need as well. So in many ways, the center is really a group of social workers that help during this time. But nowhere in that description of his center did Rabbi Bender think that he would be the person people came to when disaster struck. But Hurricane Irene changed all of that. And so the year before Hurricane Sandy hit, Hurricane Irene was threatening to come and hit the East Coast. And it was billed to be a very destructive hurricane. So people fled, evacuated, and could prepare for the worst. But like often happens, the hurricane turned at the last minute and went back into the ocean. And so there wasn't a lot of damage. During that time, they started getting a lot of calls about what to do, what new information was about, could they come back to their house. So they knew that when another hurricane hit, people would call their hotline. But this time, when Hurricane Sandy was on its way, a lot of people refused to evacuate because they had gone through it all with Irene. They had spent money to leave and kind of take off from their job for a while. So this time, a lot more people stayed. And so not only did they get calls for people trying to see if they could come back, but also calls from people who stayed and now needed help, needed services once they got there. So in order to prepare for that, Rabbi Bender got a bunch of the leaders of the community together, as well as some local law enforcement and emergency managers, to think about how they could prepare for the storm. And this is a shot of them in the Achiezer building, just kind of planning ahead of time. One of the things they talked about was how to get access to resources and how they could get access to the police officers and emergency managers there as well. When Sandy hit, that ended up not being as easy as they thought. So a lot of the leaders in the Orthodox Jewish community were on their own to provide those resources immediately after the storm. But because they had thought ahead of time and thought about Hurricane Irene, they were able to really mobilize afterwards. So when the power went out at Achiezer, they set up hotlines at Rabbi Bender's house. And they had about 17 phone lines, and they had about 1,500 phone calls a day for the first week. And so he had people working there that whole time. In addition to questions about, are people safe, or how can we kind of figure out where to congregate to get electricity or food, he ended up getting a lot of phone calls about providing donations, both goods and money, to the community. And so through that, they started what's called the Community Assistance Fund. And the Orthodox Jewish community, through this fund, raised over $11 million for their community and dispersed that within 3 to 6 months after the storm, which was really dramatic compared to how long it took for FEMA assistance and Red Cross money to come through as well. And so they did this in a couple of different ways. First, the Community Assistance Fund already existed before the storm. They had started it after the financial crisis as a way for neighbors to put aside some money to help their neighbors when they were having a hard time after the crisis. So the mechanism was already in place, but they just hadn't used it since 2008. And so they restarted this fund, ended up getting an accountant and some lawyers to volunteer their time, and set up a system so that they could get applications and track the funds and make sure that they dispersed the money as quickly as possible. And so the first phase was that they offered $1,000 to $3,000 to basically anyone in the community who applied, just so that they can get immediate assistance. So they could buy a generator if they needed it, get some food or water or other materials. The second phase was a couple of $1,000s to repair their home. So maybe they needed drywall or they needed to pay for water to be pumped out of their basement. They could apply and get money immediately to do those funds. And then the third was to a more substantial amount of $10,000, $20,000 to rebuild their homes. And that was a smaller pool of people, but again gave them access right away when they were still waiting on insurance or FEMA assistance to rebuild their homes pretty quickly. And the way that they were successful in doing this is because of the structure of the community beforehand. So there were about 28 rabbis throughout this neighborhood, since there's a lot of synagogues and you have to be able to walk to your synagogue on Saturdays. There's kind of smaller, more decentralized units. So what they did was they asked all 28 of those rabbis to ask their congregations to apply, assess their needs, and then let them know how much money they needed. So they were able to get the local knowledge right at that aspect. And then also the rabbis were able to provide more information. So if somebody had a lot of damage to their house but wasn't sure if they should ask for the funds, the rabbi could step in and say they really needed it, or somebody could come forward and say that they needed that instead. And so it was really through that network of rabbis that they already knew that they were able to give this money out so quickly. And one of the things Rabbi Bender kept mentioning was how quickly that was compared to all the other resources. And so not only did they make sure they followed the letter of the law by having an accountant and lawyers, but they also were able to do that much faster than FEMA assistants would have been able to handle the applications. And so not only did they provide immediate services by just being able to answer the phone and help, but they really found a way to get major amounts of money to their neighborhood right after the storm. The second example I have is restoring social networks. And the example I want to give to you is LaToya Cantrell. She was the president of the Broadmoor Improvement Association, which is basically like a homeowners association in the Broadmoor neighborhood of New Orleans. And she played a big role in helping the Broadmoor community recover after Hurricane Katrina. And so again, you'll notice that it's the fact that there were these organizations and people already in place before the disaster struck, that they could use those structures and systems and information that they had after a disaster. So LaToya Cantrell was the president of the Broadmoor Improvement Association, which was mostly used to kind of deal with neighborhood issues like Neighborhood Watch, or help with getting money for a new school or a new library, or dealing with block busting issues back in the 70s. But never really used on a grand scale, like to coordinate massive recovery or return or rebuilding. But they had everybody's contacts and had made a name for themselves within the community as being someplace that they could go to when they needed to address kind of broader neighborhood issues. And so immediately after the storm and after the flooding, most of the New Orleans area was blocked off, and people couldn't return and rebuild for a couple of months afterwards, depending on how much flooding there was, how much other issues that they think that there might be, if there was like looting or things like that. FEMA and other areas would block off those neighborhoods from being rebuilt. And so it wasn't until January of 2006, when a redevelopment plan was announced, that Broadmoor really thought that they were in the threat of not being allowed to return and recover. And that was based on the Bring New Orleans Back redevelopment plan. And it was announced and announced through a couple of newspapers. that they would not only find ways to bring funding and assistance to rebuild certain infrastructure in certain communities, but that they also recommended just turning some communities into green space because they were low-lying areas that received a lot of flooding. And so given that, they thought they shouldn't return to those areas, and instead we should make them parks and make people rebuild elsewhere. While that makes sense on a lot of levels, you're also eliminating these people's cultural neighborhoods, their social aspects that they're there. And so when the Broadmoor neighborhood realized they would be turned into a green dot, as they called it, the green space that was on the map, they realized they had to prove vitality in order to keep their neighborhood alive. And so this is a picture of their first meeting in January after they were labeled as a green dot. And they realized that they needed to prove that they really wanted to come back. And part of the way that they had to do that through the plan was to prove that at least 50% of the community would return and rebuild in the next few months. And so at the end of that meeting, they realized that a lot of people did want to return and that they really needed to mobilize and use a lot of the skills that they had in their community in order to do that. So the first thing to say is that the Broadmoor area is really diverse. It's very different than the Orthodox Jewish community. It's not close-knit. It's not a homogeneous area. There's a variety of incomes, of race and ethnicity. But what draws them together is the Broadmoor Improvement Association and this kind of set of streets that they were structured around. And so what they were able to do was use a lot of the media and marketing skills that they had within the community to prove that they were vital. So they started a website, they started a lot of signs that say Broadmoor lives in the heart of New Orleans, and they were also able to use their connections to get resources that they needed. And were able to talk to the media and talk about how it was an issue that the plans wanted to destroy their community and they wanted to save it. So with Contrell and some of the other neighbors in the community, they really fought back to prove that they were a vital organization. One of the ways they did that is they got the attention of a group of students at Harvard in the Belford Center at Harvard University. And they came down to help them map the rate of recovery that they were going to have. And so the set of triangles at the bottom of the screen are the progress of the neighborhood recovering over the years. So early 2006 is the first one, and the red and orange means that there were destroyed homes and people hadn't promised to return. And then by the end of 2008 is the last image on the slide. You could see that almost the entire neighborhood was rebuilt and people were promising to come back. And so it was really through those connections, even though they were a very dispersed and decentralized community, were able to come together and fight that threat of being extinct. And our third example is really kind of being a focal point or signaling recovery. And so that, again, is with a close-knit community after Hurricane Katrina. It's the Vietnamese community called the Mary Queen of Vietnam Catholic Church, which is sort of the center of that community, on the east side of New Orleans. And the church is really the heart of that community. It was a small set of immigrants who had come over in 1975 after the fall of Saigon and had really set up a new community in that area. And the church, led by Father Vienne at the time, not only provided religious services, but cultural ones as well. So they offered language services to help people translate and understand the paperwork and things they had to do in the United States. They offered farmers markets and craft fairs that reminded them of home, as well as a whole bunch of other kind of cultural aspects that you'd see people in the church throughout the week, not just on Sunday. And so after the storm, they had about 12 feet of flooding within that area, and numerous of the congregation could not evacuate before the storm. So Father Vienne, who's pictured here, stayed at the church with about 500 people during the storm. And like a lot of the stories came about, the storm itself wasn't too bad. And so after it had passed, a bunch of people went home to check on their houses and their property to see what was damaged. And at that point, the levees broke, and a massive amount of water came crashing into the community. And all of the people that had stayed for safety in the church were now dispersed among the neighborhood. So Father Vienne and a couple of his friends took boats out and literally saved a lot of people during that time. But then they had to figure out what to do afterwards. So one of the things that he did to encourage people to invest and decide to return afterwards was he traveled to all the different cities across the United States where his congregation was staying in the months after Hurricane Katrina, when they had to wait until they were allowed to come back home, and tried to convince them to return. And so when we interviewed resident after resident in the area, they said really it was after Father Vienne said come back that they realized that they could trust him, and if he said that the community would recover and it would be similar than it was before, that it would, and that they should do that. And so he really was the signal that they should return. And so one of the first things he did was start religious services back up right away. So the hurricane struck in the end of August. By November, he was holding church services that at first had a couple hundred people to, in the weeks afterwards, had over 2,000 people in November after the storm, when not many people had returned. And so when people would come back and see that at least there would be those activities, they could start thinking about rebuilding. But one of the things they faced was a language barrier for filling out forms for resources, and also trying to figure out how much access they could get to some of the public resources that were there. So Father Vienne not only began to petition the media, but also petition government officials to give them access to resources that other neighborhoods had as well. So before the storm hit, they had planned to build a new senior center next to the church, where a lot of the senior citizens in the area could live. After Katrina, clearly they couldn't start building right away, so they wanted to get FEMA trailers and put them on that land so that a lot of the senior citizens could come back and start helping in the rebuilding process, or just be there when their family was coming back as well. But FEMA didn't want to give them the trailers for that purpose, so they had to petition that they could do that. In addition, after all of the cleanup, there was a lot of rubbish and old materials they needed to discard of. And the New Orleans government had decided that they should put a landfill next to their community. And so one of the things they did was petition for that landfill to go there because it would ruin some of the community that they were interested in. So being able to not only come together to get this close-knit community back, but they also had the coalition kind of ready-made by being this really homogenous, small community to really fight back some of these other issues that they thought would dampen their neighborhood and their, the social aspect of their community. So those were just a couple of examples. We have about 5 to 6 for every chapter that we dig into, and they come across a variety of sectors. And so while we have the religious leaders and we have the business owners like Rabbi Bender, we also have people who were in the school district. And so what you would clearly think about is kind of living within a kind of public service domain, but also being able to not really innovate and go outside of the role of their jobs. But after Hurricane Katrina, they found ways to do that, to promise that their schools would return and open after the storm. So that example, her name's Doris Voitier, and she was at the St. Bernard Parish School District, which is just to the southeast of New Orleans. And she promised that if people came back, they would have the school open a couple months after the storm. And because she knew that the business owners and community members couldn't return unless they knew that their children could go to school. Because how can you rebuild when you have to also care for your children? Or why would you take them out of school somewhere else to not be in school while you're rebuilding? And so she had thousands of people sign up to register for school to come back. But then the school district and other agencies told them there was no way that they could rebuild the school in time. And so she decided that she wasn't going to listen to them, and she was going to do it anyways. So she bought trailers herself and sent the receipts in later, and found ways to make sure that both the teachers, the parents, and the students could come back and have school. And so she afterwards won a lot of awards both within the private sector as well as the public sector for her ability to kind of hold on her promise and find resources, even when it looked like it would take months for her school to be able to kind of follow all the other rules. So from there, we can think about what enables people like that, those entrepreneurs that we examined, to perform these critical roles. What hinders them from doing that as well? And what policies allow for entrepreneurs to act in innovative ways, to encourage community recovery, and to actually go about recovery as well. And one of the ways we do that is we kind of contrast the role of the entrepreneur with the role of the bureaucrat. And so you can see here a kind of list of characteristics that we think for both of them. The entrepreneur often is coming from decentralized organization or spontaneous order or bottom-up decision-making. They find ways to be adaptive and flexible, new ways to go about processes that they had before. They're often risk takers. That's why they can be the first mover and come back, because they're willing to take on those risks that other people wouldn't have, to prove that their community is worth recovering. And they really are an agent of change, whether that's introducing new businesses or business models into an organization or finding new ways for a community to get resources to recover. And contrasting that with the bureaucrat. And so that you can think of sort of top-down, centralized efforts that really need permission before you can act. Rigidity, but also the preservation of a status quo. So preserving rules for the sake of them, potentially, instead of finding which ones work and which ones don't. And one of the ways you can think about this is this doesn't necessarily mean we're talking about the private sector versus the public sector, but we're thinking about roles within all those sectors and even sometimes within the same organization. So one of the things you can think about is you can look at a business, and from their hierarchy, you may not be able to tell if they're a business full of entrepreneurs or a business full of bureaucrats, because it's really on the way that they have the autonomy to go about their job and the structures in place and the incentives in place to do that. So another example that we have is looking at the private sector after Hurricane Katrina. And so a business that you might think may look more bureaucratic because it's so huge, like Walmart, you wouldn't really expect them to give the authority and autonomy to their employees to do what's right after the storm. But that's exactly what some of the scholars at Mercatus found. So Steve Horowitz, who's written on this, has said that sort of top-down management from Walmart immediately after Hurricane Katrina told their middle managers and general managers of different stores to just do what they thought was right, because they knew that those people were victims themselves and that they had to work in that community long after the storm. And so that allowed the general managers to go about recovery in a couple of different ways. They were able to pay some of their employees while they were gone and until they had their resources to come back. They were able to open up their stores even when there was a lot of damage and just tell people to pick what they could and take it so that they had food and supplies right away. And they were also able to find new ways to open their businesses back up again. So in New Orleans, there were a couple of stores that had major damage. So what they did was they started up like tent stores that brought in some really needed supplies immediately after the storm until they could rebuild. And so that was a way that you could see even a really large company that you might think may be more bureaucratic in its structure really gave autonomy and the ability to be flexible to their employees. In the same instance, he saw a similar thing with the U.S. Coast Guard. And we can compare that with how FEMA gave authority to their employees as well. So the Coast Guard is sort of set up, dispersed throughout the United States, so people are stationed at particular areas. So a lot of the immediate Coast Guard rescue teams that were there after Hurricane Katrina were people who lived in that area and who might be dealing with a lot of the same issues that everyone else was as well. But they were given the authority to just go and do what they thought was right. And so they were able to sort of know what areas needed boats for rescue services right away, instead of waiting for commands from above to say, you need to go to this location or that location. We can compare that to FEMA, which as Hurricane Katrina continued, became more and more restrictive of what they allowed their employees to do. So at first it took a couple of days and weeks for them to really realize the extent of the damage in New Orleans and to declare it as a major disaster. That was a lot because they were trying to collect a lot of information and make assessments in a centralized manner rather than really getting on the ground and seeing what was going on. After that, when journalists and other people would ask FEMA workers, why things were going so slow or what they were working on and what issues they had, they began to become more restrictive of the rules they told their staff when talking to the media. And so they often said that they just couldn't speak to them without going through a central authority first. And so you have stories of journalists going up to FEMA workers and they're run away because they aren't allowed to talk to them. And so sort of contrasting how even within the federal government, different agencies went about recovery in really different ways and really either encouraged this entrepreneurial behavior or discouraged it and made matters worse. And so what are the policy implications that we draw from this study? The first is to avoid the top-down planning that you see so often, that desire to kind of control and gather all the information before acting. Because after a disaster, sort of all the information is uncertain, and a lot of the sort of normal rules are suspended given this time. And so kind of each day you wait to find out more information is one more day that you can't spend recovering. And Emily Chamley-Wright, who's a scholar that worked with us, called this signal noise. And so one way you can think about that is the different flood insurance maps after a storm. So both after Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Sandy, and I'm pretty sure anytime there's a big flood, because most of the flood maps are through the central government, they realize they're out of date and that they have to update them before they can decide who should be within the floodplain and should get insurance or who shouldn't. And so that additional noise after the storm makes it harder for people to file claims with their insurance or decide if it's worthwhile to recover. Another way you can think about that is the redevelopment plans. So I mentioned the first one that happened after Hurricane Katrina, the Bring New Orleans Back Commission plan. After that, there were about 5 or more plans over the next 3 years that had conflicting ideas or different areas but were never implemented. Because afterwards, it's very difficult once you've made the plan to actually implement it afterwards. And so many people had to wait and see, was their community going to get the green light to recover? Or were they going to become green space? Or would they get the money to rebuild vital infrastructure like a new school or a new library? So the sort of constant adjustment and pushback of these plans meant that it took even longer for people to make decisions if they wanted to wait to see what government would do. So in response to that, a lot of the entrepreneurs we saw didn't wait and they went ahead anyways. But imagine if that signal noise was decreased, how many more people could recover quicker? The second policy implication is to eliminate, suspend, and simplify rules that hamper entrepreneurship. One really good example of this is occupational licensing. After a storm, you have many people who are dispersed, many people with skills that can no longer work, and you need an influx of new people with new skills to come in. But if you have a lot of rules about occupational licensing and who's allowed to perform in certain professions, it makes that harder for those people to come in from other states and provide those services. So after Katrina, there were issues with roofers and construction workers and contractors about whether they had the right licensing to work in Louisiana. Likewise, people who had daycare services before the storm had a hard time reopening afterwards because they were maybe short of staff or different things like that, and it meant that the ratio between workers and children was not the right one to get licensing and approval from the city government. And so things like providing childcare services so you could focus on recovery or come back and do work was harder to do because of these occupational licensing and different zoning rules and things like that after the storm. One study that came out of this research is by a professor named David Scarbeck, and he looked at how occupational licensing could be suspended in the cases in Florida, because they have numerous hurricanes, and over the years they've decided that immediately after the storm they're going to suspend some of the rules. And they see an influx of skilled people coming in to perform those services after a storm and helping with recovery, where you saw issues with that in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. So one way to think about that are what are the rules that you can at least suspend during that time to make it easier for people to recover. And then the last policy implication is to ensure that even bureaucrats, even people in those positions that are for kind of preserving the status quo, have the ability and freedom to act when they need to act entrepreneurially. So the fact that Doris Vautier, the superintendent of the St. Bernard Parish School District, felt like she could go and act entrepreneurially to help to help make sure that the schools could open, whether or not she thought she just wouldn't get in trouble or that she would get permission later, the fact that she was able to do that meant that a whole bunch of people were able to recover faster than they would otherwise. And so what other ways could you have people, could businesses and agencies and other organizations make it so it's more like what happened with Walmart and the Coast Guard than what happened with FEMA? And with that, I'll finish up and get some of your questions.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So if you would like to ask Stefanie a question, if you'll hold up your hand, I will come to you, and then I will make my way around the room. If you'll just speak into the mic, then we'll have your question answered. Come back.
Thank you. Two questions. One very brief one. Regarding the Orthodox Jewish community on Rockaway,
Yeah.
and they made emergency provision. Did they expect to be repaid because there were, in some cases you said they were waiting for government funds to come in. Were they normally expecting to be repaid?
They weren't actually. So a lot of the donations they got at first were just donations to come to their community. And a lot of that had to do with the Orthodox Jewish network that they had. So people in Brooklyn or Baltimore or other people that had connections that just wanted to send funds. But what they did from the beginning was assume that because they act quickly, government support wouldn't be there. And that was mostly true. And so the number of people who received FEMA aid in that neighborhood was very low because they got these funds instead.
I see. Thank you.
Yep.
And the more discursive question is, I'm rather unhappy actually, as someone who studied under Kerzner for 6 years, and talking about entrepreneurship, I'm rather unhappy with the way in which the concept of entrepreneurship and the adverb entrepreneurially has become vogue in so many contexts. And I noted on one of the last pictures that you showed, it was one thing to say government controls could be removed so entrepreneurs could act. I understand that, and that's fine. But then when you talk about bureaucrats acting more entrepreneurially, I find there an enormous contradiction there. But the nature of a bureaucracy can never act entrepreneurially, and indeed if it could, it wouldn't be a bureaucracy. I mean, when I say bureaucracy, I mean top-down government provision, tax-funded, because the whole nature of entrepreneurship is it's not tax-funded, it's profit or loss.
Yeah, so I think you're right with that, and let me see if I can provide some more context. So bureaucracies in general, coming from kind of the notion of a centralized state, have a lot of the incentives at play to act more like FEMA than the Coast Guard. And the fact that the Coast Guard could act that way is most likely because they weren't the ones under the microscope afterwards as well, right? One of the things that we take in the book is to look at bureaucrats rather than bureaucracies, and to look at how we can see that sort of from a Max Weber idea of bureaucracy, that can happen in any sector. And it's mostly like a characteristic. And so the fact that we can provide the ability for somebody who normally in their job as a general manager for a major store, who just has to follow the rules and the letter of the law, they can make some adjustments given on what they know about their store and the supplies and things that are needed. But most of the time, they're not really a general manager of a major store, of a major retail chain, isn't really being entrepreneurial in the fact that they're alerting to new opportunities, but they're kind of following these ideas, that they can have the access and the ability to be alert to and adapt to opportunities. And so one of the things that comes from it is most likely FEMA, as the structure it is right now, would never, getting them the access to act more entrepreneurially won't work. But making sure people have the ability to do that, whether it's something like the Coast Guard or more like the robust civil society with businesses and nonprofits and community leaders, is what comes out of that. So another implication that comes from the book that I didn't talk about here is kind of the notion of the sort of social order that we think will be most conducive to making sure this sort of robust recovery happens, and that there's less red tape and bureaucracy that those people who do make recovery happen have to go through. So they don't have to petition FEMA to explain to them why exactly they need their trailers, right? What sort of environment does that need to be? And from that, we draw on the Ostroms, Vincent and Eleanor Ostrom. She won the Nobel Prize in 2010 for her work on common pool resources. But one of the things that comes out of their work is this notion of polycentricity, which is this idea of sort of multiple nodes of authority within society. So you have maybe multiple organizations, maybe it's small government in some way as well, but there's all these sort of dispersed ways to tackle goods and services and provisions. And it's in an environment that's more like that than like a centrally planned state that would provide the environment needed to ensure we have robust recovery. So one of the things you can think about, and for that I'd say Kerzner would probably say, I'm looking at a commercial entrepreneur, and we're saying we should look at it a little bit more broad, is that after a disaster, sort of profit and loss is a little bit murkier than it is any other time, right? Businesses aren't able to function as well. There's the idea that you have goods that are going to be destroyed and maybe you give them away, or you act charitably as a business in order to have good favor or good marketing. So I think after a disaster in particular, I think there's ways that we can look at how entrepreneurs are seeking, profit-like opportunities outside. I think another implication from this is if that works well during a disaster when institutions are really weak, is that maybe that's true elsewhere too. So maybe we then can look at, are there mechanisms like profit and loss outside of the strict market mechanism that do better than government? And we would say the central government really lacks a lot of those feedback mechanisms, but maybe small nonprofits and organizations and community leaders have better access to something that's not quite as good and robust as prices and profit and loss, but maybe go about providing the services you need for a community better than the alternative.
Well, when you were talking about the recovery and New Orleans, it just brought up. It just made me think of Detroit, and you know how it's bad. It's too much crime. It used to be a major industrial complex, but now it's pretty much a ghetto. But my question to you is, how is it that that the government could possibly make Detroit back to the way it was, and how these entrepreneurs like you were just talking about, how they can contribute and possibly help people move back to Detroit, and possibly have the auto factories be back in Detroit?
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting question. One of the things that came out after Detroit, after they declared bankruptcy, is they hired a federal emergency manager to plan their budgets because they looked at it as if it was a disaster. But one of the implications, if you would take that directly from our research, is that that kind of overly planned notion of disaster recovery isn't what's needed. So an emergency manager who can collect all the information and make decisions probably isn't what's going to be helpful in that scenario. But one of the things that I think is sort of unsettling about sort of looking at the market as a process or how these things evolve is that it might not be that the auto industry is what comes back to Detroit, right? And impetus to make them come back might be the wrong calculation of what should happen. What'll be interesting to see is, are there profit opportunities taking place? So there's some cool charter schools happening in Detroit that are making kind of new options for students who are there, and what profit opportunities are available there. But it's a good question, and the more controlled the response is, I think the harder that would be true, and the more pressure to bring back the same industries, I think, would be difficult as well. Yeah, so one of the things you can think about are the policy implications we had here. So we're saying after a major disaster, when institutions are really weak and everything's really uncertain, and it's unclear what's going to come about, that eliminating these policies like occupational licensing and things like that will allow people to return and recover. And an extension to that is, if even after a disaster, when institutions are weak and things are uncertain, civil society works without those policies, is that maybe we don't need them at all. And that might be true in a different sort of disaster, like Detroit recovering, or that might be true like in DC or thriving areas where we maybe don't need those policies at all, and that would help make it easier for businesses to open and people to kind of go about. So that's probably the most conclusion you can come from our research to that.
So I think this is kind of a good slide for my question. I noticed you say avoid top-down planning, but it seemed to me that in the Katrina example, when you were looking at the green dot communities, if there was the decision made, it seems like it might be reasonable from a cost-benefit analysis not to build new homes in a place that floods all the time, that you necessarily are going to have some deliberative collective action decision-making to identify what gets rebuilt and what doesn't, especially if you're using other people's money. And so if you accept top-down planning for some decisions, it seems inevitable that you will have that signal noise problem.
Yeah.
And on top of it, you'll have multiple plans that get proposed, vetted, and shot down, and that after that, you'll still have a lengthy public debate period, as you would through any planning department process or anything else. Could you just comment a little bit more what it means and what you would do differently on the top-down planning for things that are going to likely require top-down planning, or maybe just say, look, we don't believe in any of it whatsoever to get rid of this class of problem? And if so, what are the consequences of that?
Yeah, so I think it's one of the things that came out of the plans out of New Orleans is it seems really logical to think about, maybe the places with the most damage, the 12, 15 feet of flooding, aren't good places for people to live, right? So maybe we encourage them not to move there. And that could be something that, maybe you could, from seeing from above, make that decision. But I think one of the things that comes from that is that it doesn't take into account people having really subjective preferences, right? So one of the things that comes from Austrian economics is not only methodological individualism, but methodological subjectivity. And that means both, we can't look at a city itself and say it can act. We have to look at the people within it. But then also know that people, the goods and services they demand and want and how they go about their lives is through how they perceive it themselves. So one of the things that came out of that is, entire communities fought against the notion of the green dot. And it was because they did that that then they just sort of got dropped off of the plans because they started recovering without them. And so one of the things that was really noticeable is not only can that planner not really know what's going on in the minds of those people to see if it's worth it, their cost-benefit analysis might come out very differently than that sort of distant planner would think, because they really care about their neighbors and the culture that was there, and that overpowers the ability that they might have flooding again. But also just the serious constraints we have on being able to plan and implement those plans afterwards. And so one of the things that came about is not only did they have to constantly readjust the plans, and they never really got approved or implemented, meant that there were years of uncertainty and a lot of wasted resources bringing in these bright minds to make these plans. But the people just went on finally doing recovery without them because it took so long. And so I think that's a major limitation to when we think that it's better to come at it from top down, is that you're not going to have the information that's necessary. And once you start, it's very difficult to get those kind of winning coalitions to all agree on your big plan and make it work. And so people ended up having to just go on without them. Or particular businesses or particular schools and libraries had to wait years before they knew if they would be approved in that plan or not. And so I think one of the things that comes from sort of the notions of Austrian and public choice, but also through talking to all the kind of real people on the ground here, is that there are serious limits on what we can design and make sure happens. And that means that we have to be, whether we're uncomfortable with it or not, willing to see what dispersed individuals and organizations and neighbors and communities do to recover, instead of having sort of this kind of one-size-fits-all plan that makes them recover quicker and more resilient, right? It's the opposite that really works.
Okay, thank you. So my question would be more focused on, I guess, price gouging. So, when capitalism comes into play, you would expect that to happen. That's kind of where you want the bureaucracy to step in and set those limits, or at least make sure that that does not happen to people that don't have the funds. So in your studies, did you see any aspects of price gouging and when it took place, and ways in which the bureaucracy may have helped? Then that kind of lends to the other part of the question, which is when you say you want to take out some of the licensing is what I'm thinking, so a plumber or someone that normally does construction not having those licenses, did you see the negative effects of lowering those standards?
Yeah, so I think this is a great segue to think about what Professor Munger will talk about next month. But one of the things that is valuable about prices rising is that instead of having shortages, more supplies will come in, and so that profit opportunity that a Kersnerian entrepreneur would see is that the price of gasoline is rising in that area. I can go make a profit by sending my resources there. And so one of the things that happens when you put limits on those prices is that you end up making sure that shortages occur. And so after Hurricane Sandy, gasoline was a major problem. And there were price levels put in New Jersey in particular to make sure that gasoline didn't rise above a certain level. And then the notion, and I think we can kind of all agree that in concept it makes sense, is that you don't want people who just weathered a storm and have a bunch of things they have to deal with also have to pay exorbitant prices for gasoline. But what instead happens is then no one can access the gasoline because there's a shortage. And so you end up having to stay in line. You end up having to find new ways to go around and get what you need. So what happened in the Rockaway Peninsula is that when they didn't get access to gasoline because of those shortages, they had access to other people outside who could bring those in voluntarily. So there was a person in Baltimore who was in the Orthodox Jewish community there who was able to buy a truck full of gasoline and send it up. And so they got that because of sort of altruism or goodwill. But if that wasn't there, they wouldn't have had any. But if the price could rise, they potentially could. And so there's sort of a give and take about that, right? If the profit opportunity is there because the price is really high, people send in a bunch of supplies, then we also expect, kind of thinking of supply and demand, that then the price will lower again. But if we keep the price low and make it so that it's not profitable to send more in, then we just realize that we're just starving people of resources they need to recover. The interesting thing about occupational licensing, too, is in David Scarbeck's piece, he didn't find a lower quality of workers coming into the area. And one way you can think about that is the licensing to ensure quality or to ensure less competition? And so the fact that you can petition to government to have a license that makes it harder for you to, makes it harder for other people to compete with you, means you kind of have this ready, set demand that you can deal with. Well, after a disaster, who knows if me who petitioned to not have other plumbers is even available, and then no one is getting plumbing. And so a lot of it was that there wasn't a huge quality increase. You could think of sometimes where maybe a quality decrease is okay, too. So with the child care example, you know, maybe as somebody who had a child care service in their home before the storm, maybe now they have repairs and issues that need to be taken place, but they can still operate now just less efficiently than they did before, or with a slightly less quality, or maybe with 2 workers instead of 4. The fact that you could allow them to do that and free up the time for people's parents to go to work and job, even if there's the basement's still getting fixed and maybe it's not the best quality right now, means that eventually they will do that. And so sometimes the quality decrease might be okay if it means we can get the services we need later. But it's a good question to think about how essential are occupational licensing to do that, right? I just defended my dissertation. It'd be a lot easier for me to be like, it's going to be even harder for you guys to do the same, because I'm going to set up occupational licensing rules so that I get to be the professor. But that's probably not going to be like better for economics and, you know, humanity and things like that. So probably won't.
Thank you for clarifying that. I wanted to piggyback some on Professor Brady's point earlier about entrepreneurship and whether or not bureaucrats can, in fact, act entrepreneurially. I think when we hear the word entrepreneurship, we hear economic calculation taken out necessarily by private, for-profit actors in a given space, and that maybe the reason bureaucrats can't act entrepreneurially or non-entrepreneurially in the first place is because they've been removed from that market for economic calculation where we have prices. Going off of that, and in part on the previous question, I'm wondering if you found many instances of black market activity, which we would just say are economic actors hoping to meet the demands they see in a place like New Orleans, you know, more about the people who actually brought the goods, so to speak, as opposed to the more social or religious nodes of leadership.
Yeah, so a couple of the examples that we highlight in the book are kind of traditional kind of for-profit businesses and entrepreneurs as well. So there, one, his name was Ben Sessick, and he was in Chalmette, which is a part of St. Bernard Parish. He had worked in a coffee shop and managed coffee shops for a couple of years, and was an immigrant who came in over from Turkey. And after Hurricane Katrina, he realized that there were these whole areas, sort of a little further out than the city of New Orleans, that people were trying to recover, but they had no access to goods or services. And so it was purely being alert to a profit opportunity that he could open a coffee shop and provide good, like coffee and food and all these things, that he could then help. He could provide a service that both enriched him and the other people around him. So one of the things that's interesting about his coffee shop is it then became sort of a social center. And so an unintended consequence of pursuing profit meant that there was now this place where people could come and share stories about the best contractor and the person who maybe cheated them on work and what they should do. They could find ways to fill out forms for FEMA, or they could just complain about their day and see people afterwards. And so an unintended consequence of him pursuing profit meant that kind of all these other things could take place. which I think is something that we often don't think about when we want to say that, pursuing profit is bad, right? The thing that, is also worth noting is he was very successful after the storm, and particularly successful at providing that social space. Now, when we go back to that area, his coffee shop isn't in business anymore. And that's because there were other competition and forces at place. There's new places like that around. I think one of the things, too, that we look at, too, is that, economic calculation is really important. We would say that there's a lot of limits, and a lot of the limits and constraints that we highlight for centrally planned efforts is precisely that they've eliminated those mechanisms, and they can't, it doesn't matter how much information you try to collect, it's not the right kind, and it's not pursued in the way that would allocate resources to its most beneficial use. But after a disaster, the price signals are a little hazy, and so they might not be the kind of lightning calculations that we'd like to think they are. And so in that space, you might have, which is, I guess, part of the controversial bit of this topic, right, is that you might have religious leaders and social leaders that we can say are entrepreneurs in that way. Or we might say that a centrally planned effort really lacks those mechanisms. And even any mechanisms we could say are similar, like voting, doesn't really work out that way. But maybe in the social sector, there are mechanisms that are not as great as the kind of lightning calculators of profit and price, but better than the alternative. And so that's interesting too. Kerzner, in fact, at one point says, and Mises says this too, is that everyone has the ability to act entrepreneurially. And some of his examples are outside of the price mechanism. It's just when we think that those will work best. And so I'd say nothing from this presentation should say we don't think markets are important. In fact, the prices being able to rise and people being able to come in and compete are very crucial. But maybe in that sense, some of these other people that we call entrepreneurs in this scenario can do that as well.
And we have run out of time. I would like to thank Stefanie again for this great presentation, and give her a big hand.
Thank you. Thank you.
So feel free to join us. Don't forget that on November 5th, we'll be back here again, and so we'll be able to talk a little bit more about price gouging and the sort of the issues, the moral issues around it. I think is actually a fascinating topic. So thank you all for coming tonight, and we look forward to seeing you again.
Hi. Fred Fulver. I've been working with James and Eric